I arrived at the playground and found my mother telling other moms that I have HIV and that my children are dangerous. 8 children had already been forbidden from playing with my kids. Meanwhile, she was recording my reaction, wanting to prove that I'm aggressive. One mom's cell phone pointed directly at my face while 8 children were literally dragged by their arms away from my 6-year-old twin sons who were playing innocently on the red slide at the community playground was the image that greeted me on a sunny Tuesday afternoon when I arrived 15 minutes late to pick up Pedro and Lucas from the supervised playdate we organized weekly with other neighborhood families. Never remotely imagining that my own mother, Vera, had spent the last 40 minutes systematically destroying my family's reputation through lies so absurd and cruel they seemed extracted from a dramatic movie script, rather than a possible reality in the quiet residential community where we'd lived for 4 years, building respectful relationships with neighbors. My 39 years of existence carefully built on foundations of honest work as a project manager at a tech company, a stable 12-year marriage to Roberto, and especially the comforting certainty that I deeply knew all the important people in my life, instantly crumbled when I noticed the absolute and hostile silence dominating that normally noisy playground, full of children's laughter and animated conversations between parents supervising play, replaced by an icy atmosphere of collective judgment, directed specifically against me and my innocent children, who didn't understand why their little friends were being suddenly pulled away from them, as if they were carriers of a deadly contagious disease. The scene unfolding before my incredulous eyes had the surreal quality of a waking nightmare, where every visual and auditory detail was permanently etched in memory with painful clarity. Patricia firmly holding the hand of her 6-year-old daughter Beatrice, who was crying, confused, wanting to go back to play with Pedro on the swing. 3 other moms literally forming a physical barrier between their children and my twins, who stood frozen in the middle of the empty playground, looking around without understanding what was happening. And especially my mother Vera, strategically positioned near the entrance gate, holding her modern cell phone pointed directly at me with a triumphant expression that revealed disturbing satisfaction in observing my growing confusion, rapidly transforming into absolute panic before that impossible situation. Marina has finally arrived. Now you'll be able to see with your own eyes the aggressive and uncontrolled behavior I was describing to you earlier. Watch how she'll react when confronted about hiding critical medical information that puts all our children at risk of contamination. I heard Vera announcing in a voice loud enough for all the moms present to clearly hear, while keeping her phone firmly pointed to capture my reaction in high-definition video that she obviously planned to use later as distorted evidence of some false narrative she had meticulously constructed during my absence. The absolute confusion dominating my mind in that initial moment prevented rational processing of what was happening. What critical medical information was Vera claiming I had hidden? What contamination risk was she suggesting my children posed to other playground kids? Why was my own mother orchestrating this publicly humiliating scene instead of talking privately with me about any legitimate concerns she might have about my children's health or safety? Questions accumulated frantically as I walked slowly through the playground entrance gate, feeling dozens of judging eyes fixed on me, as if I were a dangerous criminal invading a safe community space instead of a dedicated mom simply picking up her kids after an afternoon of play. Vera, what's going on here? Why are you filming? And why are other moms pulling their kids away from my boys as if they had some contagious disease? I managed to articulate in a controlled voice. Despite my racing heart beating so violently, I could feel pulses echoing in my ears like war drums announcing imminent battles. My mother smiled coldly with that particular expression I'd learned to recognize during decades of living together as an indicator of calculated manipulation about to be revealed, adjusted the phone angle to better capture my face while preparing to pronounce words that would completely transform my peaceful life into a public nightmare of orchestrated social humiliation. Marina, these mothers deserve to know the truth about your medical condition that you've been selfishly hiding while allowing your potentially infected children to play freely with healthy kids without any precaution or prior warning. Vera declared in a theatrically loud voice, ensuring every word was clearly audible to everyone present at the playground, and especially perfectly captured in the video recording she was methodically producing. You've been HIV positive for at least 3 years, as I discovered through medical documents I accidentally found when I was helping you organize your personal files last month. And your twin sons were born when you were already infected, which means they have a very high probability of also being virus carriers, putting all the other children at risk whenever they play together, especially when small accidents with scratches or bleeding occur that are common in playgrounds. The absolute shock of that public and completely false accusation left me literally unable to breathe properly for a few seconds while my mind kept freezing, trying to process the enormity of the lie my own mother had just publicly pronounced before at least 10 other moms who now looked at me with a mixture of horror, disgust, and especially protective maternal fury directed against someone who had supposedly put their children at risk of contamination by a serious disease without any warning or responsible precaution. The absolute falsity of that accusation was so obvious to me that initially I couldn't even formulate a coherent response. I didn't have HIV, had never been diagnosed with any sexually transmitted disease, performed complete annual medical exams that always returned perfectly normal and healthy results. And especially my children were absolutely healthy kids without any medical condition that posed a risk to other children during normal playground play. That's an absurd and completely fabricated lie. I don't have HIV, was never diagnosed with this disease or any other serious medical condition, and my children are perfectly healthy as all the regular pediatric exams we religiously perform attest. I protested in a voice that began to rise in volume, driven by growing indignation before that false accusation so serious and publicly humiliating. I immediately noticed Vera adjust her phone, capturing my emotional reaction, while smiling satisfied as if I were following exactly the script she had planned in advance. Make an absurd public accusation, film my naturally emotive and defensive reaction, and then use that distorted recording as evidence of aggressive and uncontrolled behavior that would prove the false narratives she was systematically building about my character. See how she reacts aggressively when confronted with the truth about hiding critical medical information that puts our children at risk. Exactly the violent and irresponsible behavior I was describing to you before she arrived. Vera narrated to her phone and to the moms present as if she were documenting evidence for a future legal process. Patricia took a protective step forward, positioning herself between me and the children while holding her daughter Beatrice more firmly against her body, as if I were literally an immediate physical threat to child safety. Marina, if what Vera is saying is true about you having HIV and not having informed any of us while allowing your children to play freely with ours, that's absolutely irresponsible and possibly criminal depending on laws about conscious exposure to contagious diseases without adequate prior warning, she declared in a trembling voice, mixing genuine fear with growing anger. The sensation of being trapped in a Kafkaesque nightmare where objective reality had been completely replaced by false accusations, accepted as unquestionable truth by the manipulated audience, was absolutely suffocating and paralyzing. How could I prove a negative? That I didn't have the disease Vera was falsely claiming I possessed? Offer to show recent medical exam results proving my perfect health? But that would require exposing personal medical privacy to satisfy absurd accusations made by a clearly ill-intentioned person, and especially would validate the implicit premise that I should prove innocence instead of Vera needing to prove her extraordinary accusations with real evidence, instead of supposedly found medical documents that obviously didn't exist, because I didn't have the condition she was maliciously claiming. Vera, you know perfectly well you're lying because you never found any medical documents indicating I have HIV for the simple fact that such documents don't exist since I don't have this disease, I declared with growing firmness while trying to control the fury threatening to explode into a more intense verbal confrontation that would only serve Vera's manipulative purposes of portraying me as an aggressive and uncontrolled person. You're deliberately fabricating gravely false accusations against me publicly before this entire community, destroying my reputation and especially traumatizing my children who are watching their moms pull their little friends away from them as if they were dangerous, and all this while filming my natural indignation reaction to use later out of context as supposed evidence of problematic behavior. The words came out of my mouth with surprising clarity considering the internal emotional chaos progressively devastating me. Part of me simply wanted to grab my kids and immediately leave that hostile playground before the situation escalated further. But another part instinctively understood that fleeing at that moment would be interpreted by the other moms as implicit admission of guilt, or at least as suspicious behavior of someone trying to avoid confrontation about inconvenient truths. Vera had built an almost perfect psychological trap where any reaction of mine, whether staying and confronting the false accusations or leaving quickly with my kids, could be distorted and used as additional evidence in the manipulative narratives she was methodically weaving about my supposed problematic character and irresponsible behavior as a mother. If Marina really doesn't have HIV as she so vehemently claims, then she should have no problem presenting recent medical exam results, proving her healthy condition, and especially exams of her children. showing they also weren't infected vertically during pregnancy or childbirth, suggested another mom named Andrea, who I knew only superficially from casual interactions during previous playground meetings. Her apparently reasonable suggestion on the surface was actually deeply problematic because it established a dangerous precedent where anyone could make a false medical accusation against another and then demand that the victim publicly prove their health through exposure of private medical records to satisfy curiosity or paranoia of ill-intentioned accusers. Andrea, with all respect, my medical condition and that of my children is an absolutely private matter that I don't need to and shouldn't share publicly to refute false accusations made without any real evidence by a person who is clearly trying to harm me through deliberate lies. I responded, maintaining a firm but controlled tone despite the growing temptation to explode emotionally before that absurd situation. If Vera genuinely possesses medical documents proving her allegations about me having HIV, then she should present them immediately instead of simply making verbal accusations while filming my naturally defensive reaction. Otherwise, what we have here is clearly a case of malicious and slanderous defamation that could result in serious legal consequences for whoever is making these false and gravely harmful allegations to my personal and professional reputation. The mention of potential legal consequences made Vera hesitate momentarily, with an expression suggesting quick calculation about whether she had exceeded in false accusations to the point of creating real legal risks for herself. But she quickly recovered her manipulative composure and adjusted her strategy to apparently safer territory. I'm not making unfounded accusations. I'm simply expressing legitimate concerns as a worried grandmother about my grandchildren's well-being and as a responsible member of this community who has the right to know about potential health risks to children who regularly play together, she declared in a tone trying to sound reasonable and maternal instead of malicious and manipulative. If Marina is so confident about her healthy condition, surely she wouldn't have a problem performing new complete medical exams including specific tests for HIV and other transmissible diseases, and then sharing the results with all of us to reassure the legitimate concerns that were raised today about our children's safety. Vera's strategic reformulation, transforming direct false accusations into legitimate maternal concerns, was a classic manipulative maneuver that shifted focus from the falsity of her original allegations to my supposed lack of willingness to cooperate with apparently reasonable requests for medical transparency intended to protect innocent children. It was a sophisticated rhetorical trap because any refusal of mine to submit to unnecessary medical exams and share results publicly could be interpreted by other moms as evidence that I had something to hide, even though the obvious truth was that no one should be forced to publicly prove personal health just because someone made a false accusation without any factual foundation. I realized I was losing that battle of public perception, regardless of how rational and legally correct my positions on medical privacy and the right not to be defamed through false accusations were. The other moms had already been influenced by Vera's narratives during the 40 minutes she had exclusive access to them before my arrival, planting seeds of distrust and fear that now rapidly bloomed into collective hostility directed against me and my innocent children. Mommy, why can't Beatriz play with me anymore? Did I do something wrong? Pedro's small and confused voice interrupted the adult confrontation, bringing focus back to the real victims of that absurd situation. 2 6-year-old children who understood absolutely nothing about diseases, defamation, or complex psychological manipulations executed by supposedly responsible adults, but who were directly experiencing the emotional pain of sudden and inexplicable social rejection by little friends with whom they had been playing happily just an hour before. My heart broke seeing my twin sons standing alone in the middle of that empty playground, looking confused at the other children being physically prevented by their moms from approaching them, not understanding what terrible crime they had supposedly committed to deserve that cruel and sudden social ostracism. That moment of painful clarity about the true human impact of Vera's cruel manipulations, not just destroying my adult reputation that could eventually be repaired through legal processes and rational explanations, but especially psychologically traumatizing 2 innocent children who would learn prematurely about human cruelty, unjust social rejection, and especially about how close people, including family, can cause deep emotional wounds through deliberately malicious choices, completely transformed my approach to that impossible situation, from defensive and explanatory to protective and decisive focused, exclusively on minimizing damage to my children, regardless of costs, to my personal reputation or community relationships, already irreparably damaged by Vera's systematic lies. Pedro, Lucas, come here with me now, we're going home, I ordered in a firm but gentle voice, extending my hands to my children who immediately ran to my protective embrace, seeking emotional security in the middle of that confusing storm of adults shouting incomprehensible accusations. Before turning to leave that playground that had transformed from a welcoming community space into a hostile public tribunal where I was judged and condemned without any real evidence based exclusively on false accusations from my own mother, I turned directly to Vera, still holding her phone filming that final scene with disturbing satisfaction visible in her cold, calculating eyes. Vera, you just crossed an irreversible line making such serious false public accusations against me before this entire community, and especially traumatizing your own grandchildren through cruel lies, intended exclusively to harm me for motivations I still don't fully understand, but will certainly discover, I declared with icy calm, masking growing fury boiling under the controlled surface. You'll receive official notification from my lawyer about the defamation and slander lawsuit I'm initiating immediately, and especially about protective measures. I'll be seeking to prevent any future contact between you and my children until you're psychologically evaluated and satisfactorily explain why you elaborated this malicious scheme to destroy my reputation through such gravely harmful false medical accusations. Vera's expression subtly changed from triumphant satisfaction to nascent concern upon realizing that her manipulative strategy of portraying me as an aggressive and irresponsible person had potentially created real legal consequences for herself through documented defamation on video she herself had meticulously produced, capturing her own false words pronounced publicly before multiple witnesses. I firmly held my children's hands and walked with dignity through the exit gate of that playground, leaving behind a group of confused moms, processing whether they had been manipulated into participating in a cruel scheme against an innocent mother, or if they really needed to maintain protective vigilance against a potentially dangerous person, as Vera had convincingly alleged during those 40 minutes of exclusive access to their maternal anxieties about child safety. The 10-minute walk home, located 3 blocks beyond the playground, was an emotionally devastating journey where I needed to simultaneously process my own confusion and fury about what had just happened, while trying to explain to 2 confused and hurt 6-year-old boys why their little friends had been suddenly forbidden to play with them without any comprehensible explanation from a child's perspective. Mommy, did Grandma Vera say that Lucas and I are dangerous? What does that mean? Did we hurt someone accidentally? Pedro asked in a small voice loaded with innocent guilt about imaginary crimes they certainly hadn't committed, but now believed they had perpetrated in some mysterious way that adults understood, but children couldn't adequately grasp. How to explain to 6-year-old children that their own grandmother had deliberately lied publicly about them being carriers of a serious disease to harm their mother through family reputation destruction? How to protect childhood innocence while simultaneously preparing them for the cruel reality that some people, including close relatives, can make malicious choices that cause deep emotional wounds for motivations that remain obscure and incomprehensible, even to adults rationally processing those impossible situations. The overwhelming responsibility of navigating that devastating parental moment where I needed to simultaneously validate my children's confused feelings, protect them from inappropriate adult details about complex psychological manipulations, and especially rebuild some sense of emotional security in a world that had suddenly revealed itself to be much crueler and more unpredictable than they had previously experienced in their protected existences of privileged childhood, in a quiet residential neighborhood was absolutely paralyzing in its impossible complexity. You didn't do absolutely anything wrong, my loves, and you're not dangerous in any way. I began carefully choosing words that were simultaneously honest and appropriate for the cognitive development of 6-year-old children. Sometimes adults say things that aren't true for complicated reasons that even mommy is still trying to fully understand. But the most important thing you need to know now is that mommy and daddy love you unconditionally and will always protect you against anyone who tries to hurt you through unfair words or actions. When we finally arrived home and I closed the front door, creating a physical barrier between my family and that hostile playground that now represented only traumatic memories instead of a welcoming community space, I finally allowed the emotions repressed during that public confrontation to explode through silent tears rolling down my face while watching my innocent children sitting on the living room couch, hugging each other confusedly, processing that afternoon's impossible experiences that would permanently transform their perceptions about social security and reliability of adults, including extended family who should protect them instead of deliberately traumatizing them. Roberto would arrive from work in approximately 2 hours, and would need to be informed immediately about everything that had happened that afternoon, so we could make urgent joint decisions about legal measures against Vera, strategies to protect our children from additional emotional damage, and especially about how to navigate inevitable social consequences in a community where our reputation had been systematically destroyed through false accusations so serious that people would presume guilt instead of innocence, regardless of any objective evidence demonstrating the falsity of the malicious allegations. The first call I made after ensuring my children were temporarily distracted watching cartoons on the living room television was to Dr. Helena, our family doctor for 8 years, who knew perfectly our complete medical history, including all annual exams, proving our exemplary health without any chronic condition or transmissible disease that justified concerns about safety during normal social interactions. Dr. Helena, I urgently need complete official documentation about my medical condition and especially results of all exams performed in the last 5 years, including specifically tests for HIV and other transmissible diseases. I explained quickly when she answered after 3 rings. My mother made false public accusations today at a community playground claiming I'm an HIV carrier for 3 years and that my children were potentially vertically infected, causing panic among other moms who now forbid their children from playing with mine. And I need irrefutable official medical documentation proving the absolute falsity of these defamatory allegations before rumors spread even further through the community, completely destroying our family reputation. Dr. Helena remained in shocked silence for a few seconds, processing the enormity of that absurd situation before responding with professional indignation about malicious use of false medical information to harm a patient's reputation, whom she personally knew to be completely healthy. Marina, I need you to understand the gravity of this situation before making any hasty decisions about how to proceed legally against your own mother for public defamation. Dr. Helena explained with that particular combination of medical professionalism and human empathy she had developed during decades treating patients facing physical and emotional health crises. I have your complete medical records here in my office, including all annual exams performed in the last 8 years since you became my patient, and I can categorically confirm you were never diagnosed with HIV or any other sexually transmitted disease. Sitting in the upholstered chair of the medical office I religiously visited for annual checkups, I gripped the cell phone with excessive force while simultaneously processing the professional validation of my perfect health, and especially the devastating reality that I needed that official confirmation to combat absurd lies my own mother had maliciously spread to an entire community of neighbors. The soft afternoon light filtered through the office's beige curtains created a paradoxically tranquil atmosphere, considering the emotional chaos dominating my life since that impossible playground scene 3 hours earlier. Doctor, I need you to prepare complete official documentation, including all negative HIV and other transmissible disease test results performed during the last 5 years, with official stamps and authenticated signatures that unequivocally prove the falsity of the allegations publicly made against me today. I requested maintaining a controlled voice despite the fury boiling under the apparently calm surface. My mother destroyed my reputation in an entire community through gravely false medical accusations, and especially traumatized my children by having their little friends forbidden from playing with them as if they were carriers of a deadly, contagious disease. Dr. Helena remained briefly silent, processing the disturbing implications of that situation, transcending simple medical questions into territory of cruel and potentially criminal family manipulation. Marina, I'll prepare a complete medical dossier today, including a formal declaration attesting to your exemplary health, and especially clarifying that people living with HIV under adequate treatment don't represent any transmission risk during normal social interactions, so even if the false allegations were true, the other mom's panic reaction would be completely disproportionate and based on ignorance about how the virus actually transmits, she offered generously. But I need to warn you that medical documentation alone probably won't be sufficient to completely repair the reputational damage caused by your mother's lies. Because rumors about stigmatized diseases tend to persist in people's memories even after being categorically refuted by objective evidence. Dr. Helena's wise but discouraging words confirmed my worst fears about lasting consequences of that impossible afternoon. Even if I could conclusively prove through irrefutable medical documentation that Vera's allegations were completely false, the stigma associated with HIV was so deeply rooted in popular imagination that many people would continue associating my family with that disease regardless of how much contrary evidence was presented. The fundamental injustice of that situation, where the defamation victim needs to work tirelessly to prove innocence, while the malicious accuser doesn't face immediate consequences for the devastating lies she deliberately spread, was absolutely revolting. When I finally hung up the phone after scheduling an appointment to pick up the official medical documentation the next day, I found Roberto standing at the living room entrance, watching our twin sons watching cartoons with that particular expression of worried confusion, indicating he had just arrived from work and perceived something was gravely wrong based on the tense atmosphere dominating our normally cheerful and welcoming home. Roberto was a brown-skinned 43-year-old man working as a civil engineer at a construction company. His black hair was beginning to show growing white strands at the temples, conferring an air of premature maturity caused by stressful professional responsibilities. And especially his brown eyes demonstrated that combination of analytical intelligence and emotional sensitivity that made him an exceptional partner during complex family crises. "Marina, what happened? Why are you home in the middle of the afternoon when you should be working? And especially why do Pedro and Lucas seem so quiet and withdrawn, instead of playing happily as they normally do after school?" Roberto asked with growing concern as he walked closer to me, placing a gentle hand on my tense shoulder. His simple physical presence offered some emotional comfort in the middle of that nightmare that had exploded into our quiet family life without any prior warning. But simultaneously, the need to explain to him that entire absurd situation made the trauma painfully relive itself through the verbal narrative I would need to construct chronologically organizing events that still seemed unreal and impossible, even having directly experienced them. During the following 40 minutes, I meticulously related everything that had happened that impossible afternoon at the community playground, the late arrival finding 8 children being dragged away from our kids, Vera deliberately filming my reaction while making false public accusations about me having HIV and my children being potentially infected, the collective hostility of the other moms who had been manipulated during the 40 minutes of exclusive access Vera had to them before my arrival, and especially the visible trauma in our innocent children, who didn't understand why they had been suddenly transformed into social pariahs, rejected by the little friends with whom they had been playing happily just hours before. Roberto remained silent during my entire detailed narrative, his expression gradually changing from concern to absolute disbelief, and finally to controlled fury, making jaw muscles visibly contract while he mentally processed the devastating implications of what I was describing. "Your mother made false public accusations about you having HIV before at least 10 other moms at the playground, deliberately filming your natural emotional reaction of indignation to use later as distorted evidence of aggressive behavior. All this while our 6-year-old children watched their little friends being physically prevented from playing with them," Roberto summarized in a controlled voice but obviously loaded with growing fury. What kind of psychologically maladjusted grandmother elaborates such a cruel and calculated scheme specifically intended to destroy her own daughter's reputation, and especially to psychologically traumatize her own grandchildren through publicly orchestrated social ostracism? Roberto's rhetorical question echoed exactly the questioning that had dominated my mind during the last hours, trying to understand possible motivations for behavior so bizarre and deliberately malicious on Vera's part. But unfortunately, I didn't possess satisfactory answers that could rationally explain why my own mother had chosen that specific afternoon to execute such an elaborate and devastating public attack against my family reputation. Roberto walked to the living room window, looking thoughtfully at the quiet street of the residential neighborhood where we'd lived for 4 years, building respectful relationships with neighbors who now probably saw us as a dangerous family, hiding contagious diseases while allowing infected children to play freely, putting others at risk. "Marina, we need to take immediate legal action against your mother for malicious defamation, and especially for causing deliberate psychological suffering to our children through cruel lies intended to destroy social relationships that are fundamental for healthy emotional development of 6-year-old children," Roberto declared with professional determination, reflecting his analytical engineer personality, accustomed to identifying structural problems and implementing practical solutions. "I'll call Marcelo right now, that lawyer specializing in family law who worked with us during the house purchase 3 years ago. And I'll request an emergency consultation still today to discuss legal options, including a defamation lawsuit, request for a restraining order preventing your mother from having any contact with our children, and especially strategies to mitigate reputational damage in the community before rumors spread even further." Roberto's practical efficiency in crisis moments was one of the qualities I most admired in him during our 12 years of marriage. But part of me felt conflicting emotional resistance about transforming that painful family situation into a formal legal case that would inevitably create permanent and irreparable divisions in our extended family. On the other hand, the vivid memory of the confused and hurt expression on Pedro and Lucas's faces when their little friends were forbidden from playing with them quickly dissolved any ambivalence about the need to protect our innocent children against additional emotional damage caused by Vera's cruel manipulations, regardless of cost to family relationships already irreparably damaged by malicious choices she had consciously made. While Roberto made the phone call to the lawyer, I silently walked to the living room couch where Pedro and Lucas remained sitting side by side, watching cartoons with that quality of absent attention indicating their minds were processing recent traumatic experiences instead of actually absorbing television content. I sat between them, wrapping both in a protective embrace while trying to formulate adequate words that could offer some emotional comfort, without exposing them to inappropriate adult details about complex psychological manipulations executed by a relative who should protect them instead of deliberately traumatizing them. "Mommy, won't we be able to play with our friends ever again?" Lucas asked in a small voice loaded with sadness that broke my heart into pieces. The simple question revealed that in his mind that sudden social ostracism was permanent instead of temporary, based on misunderstanding that could eventually be clarified through rational explanations and objective evidence. How to explain to a 6-year-old child complex concepts about defamation, social stigma associated with diseases, and especially about how some people, including close relatives, can make cruel choices causing suffering to innocents for motivations that remain obscure, even to adults trying to rationally understand. "My loves, you'll be able to play with your friends again very soon after Mommy and Daddy talk with all the other families and explain that the things Grandma Vera said today weren't true." I responded carefully, choosing words that were honest but appropriate for childlike understanding. Sometimes adults say incorrect things that confuse other people. But when the truth is clearly explained through documents and honest conversations, confusing situations can be resolved and friendships can be restored. The words came out of my mouth with superficial confidence, masking deep doubts about whether it would really be possible to completely repair reputational damage caused by accusations so serious and stigmatized, regardless of how much contrary evidence was presented. Pedro looked at me with those expressive brown eyes identical to mine and asked a question revealing surprisingly sharp, childlike understanding about complex family dynamics. "Mommy, why did Grandma Vera say untrue things that made our friends scared to play with us? Is she mad at us for something we did wrong?" The devastating innocence of that question, assuming they surely must have committed some grave error to deserve that cruel treatment, demonstrated how children naturally internalize guilt for negative situations, even when they're clearly innocent victims of malicious adult manipulations. "You didn't do absolutely anything wrong, my loves, and Grandma Vera isn't mad at you specifically." I tried to explain, carefully navigating between appropriate honesty and protection of childhood innocence. Sometimes adults have complicated problems between them that make them say or do things that end up hurting innocent people who have nothing to do with those original problems. The most important thing you need to understand now is that Mommy and Daddy love you unconditionally, that you're wonderful and healthy children who did nothing wrong, and that we're going to work very hard to resolve this confusing situation that happened today at the playground. Roberto finished the phone call and walked to the couch, joining our collective embrace, while sharing information about the emergency consultation he had scheduled with the lawyer for that same evening at 7 o'clock. Marcelo said the situation I described to him clearly constitutes malicious defamation and potentially moral harassment, especially considering the false accusations were made publicly before multiple witnesses, and especially involved minor children who were psychologically traumatized by the resulting social ostracism. Roberto explained, keeping his voice low not to further alarm our children. He recommended we meticulously document everything that happened today, including names of all witnesses present, video recordings Vera produced and potentially shared with other people, and especially the children's testimonies about how they felt during and after the incident. The mention of collecting testimonies from Pedro and Lucas about recent traumatic experiences filled me with apprehension about forcing them to relive painful memories of that impossible afternoon. But simultaneously, I understood the practical need to document emotional impact on our children as substantial evidence for future legal proceedings. Roberto perceived my hesitation and quickly clarified. Marcelo said child testimonies should be collected by psychologists specializing in pediatric trauma using appropriate techniques that minimize re-traumatization, so we don't need to interrogate the boys ourselves about painful experiences. Trained professionals will do this gently and therapeutically appropriately. The following hours until the lawyer consultation were dedicated to trying to reestablish some appearance of normalcy and family routine through comforting activities like the boys' favorite dinner and an extended session of reading children's stories before bed. But the tense atmosphere remained palpable even during apparently tranquil moments. Pedro and Lucas were unusually quiet during dinner. pushing food around their plates, instead of eating with the normal characteristic appetite of active 6-year-old children, and especially asking occasional questions about when they could return to play at the playground with their friends that revealed that concern dominated their thoughts, even when trying to distract themselves with other activities. When it finally came time to leave for the lawyer consultation, we asked Claudia, our 46-year-old neighbor who lived 3 houses down and who fortunately hadn't been present at the playground during that afternoon's catastrophic incident, to come watch Pedro and Lucas while Roberto and I dealt with adult legal matters. Claudia was a Black woman with short curly hair and attentive brown eyes who worked as an early childhood education teacher, and especially had developed a close relationship with our children through years of casual neighborhood interactions, including birthday parties, community barbecues, and especially generous willingness to help with emergency childcare when necessary. Marina, Roberto, you can go calmly resolve what you need to resolve. I'll stay here with the boys and we'll do fun activities to keep them distracted until you return. Claudia offered with characteristic gentleness, while observing our tense faces that obviously revealed substantial stress even though we hadn't shared specific details about the nature of the emergency requiring a nighttime legal consultation. Something in her empathetic expression suggested she might have already heard rumors about the playground incident through the informal communication network connecting neighborhood neighbors, but she discreetly chose not to mention anything that could increase our already elevated emotional discomfort. The 15-minute drive to the lawyer's office located in a modern commercial building downtown was made in tense silence where both Roberto and I individually processed the devastating implications of what had happened that afternoon and especially tried to mentally anticipate what would be the next practical steps to protect our family and repair reputational damage that had already begun spreading through the community like a social virus impossible to completely contain. Roberto drove with excessive attention characteristic of when he was stressed, checking rearview mirrors with unnecessary frequency, and keeping hands firmly gripping the steering wheel as if driving were an activity, requiring total concentration instead of an automated skill developed through decades of practice. Roberto, what do you think motivated Vera to do something so elaborate and cruel against our family? I asked, finally breaking the oppressive silence dominating the car's interior. I always maintained a respectful relationship with her, even if it wasn't excessively close after I married and established my own independent family. We had occasional disagreements about the boys' upbringing choices like any mother and mother-in-law naturally have, but nothing that remotely justified enough hatred to elaborate such a devastating public attack, specifically intended to destroy my reputation and traumatize her own grandchildren. Roberto remained silent considering my question while navigating through moderate evening traffic flowing through the city's artificially lit avenues. Honestly, Marina, I can't understand rational motivations for behavior so bizarre and deliberately malicious. He finally responded with evident frustration. Mentally healthy people don't elaborate cruel schemes intended to destroy close relatives' reputations through gravely false medical accusations deliberately filmed for later use as distorted evidence. Something is fundamentally wrong with your mother's psychological state, whether due to age, related cognitive deterioration, previously undiagnosed personality disorder, or perhaps external influence from someone who's manipulating her to act against you for motivations we haven't yet identified. Roberto's suggestion about possible external influence manipulating Vera to act maliciously against me awakened a specific memory that had been buried in my subconscious during that entire chaotic afternoon. Approximately 3 months before the playground incident, Vera had casually mentioned during a family dinner that she was participating in a new online discussion group about grandparents' rights who claim to be unjustly separated from grandchildren by controlling adult children. At the time, I thought it was simply a harmless social hobby for a lonely elderly person seeking community connections through shared interests. But now, with the devastating perspective provided by that afternoon's events, that memory assumed potentially sinister significance about Vera possibly having been radicalized by an online group promoting paranoid narratives about adult children conspiring against elderly parents. Roberto, I just remembered that 3 months ago, Vera mentioned participating in an online group about grandparents' rights, and I'm wondering if perhaps she was influenced by toxic narratives shared in that context that convinced her I was trying to separate her from the boys, even though objectively our family relationship was perfectly functional and respectful. I speculated while my mind tried to construct explanatory narratives that made some sense of the impossible situation. These online groups sometimes function as echo chambers where resentments are amplified, and vulnerable people are gradually radicalized to believe in family conspiracies that don't objectively exist. Roberto briefly considered my theory before responding with cautious skepticism characteristic of his analytical personality. It's possible that toxic online group influence contributed to your mother's judgment deterioration about our family, but even so, it seems a substantial leap from simply believing in paranoid narratives to actively elaborating and executing such a calculated public attack involving making specific false medical accusations while deliberately filming to create distorted evidence of your supposed aggressive behavior, he rationally observed. We need to seriously consider the possibility that Vera is experiencing some type of cognitive decline or psychological disorder, affecting her judgment about the consequences of her actions. We arrived at the commercial building where the lawyer's office operated, parked in the basement lit by cold, fluorescent lights creating a depersonalized institutional atmosphere, and walked silently through empty corridors to elevators that took us to the 12th floor, where discreet signs indicated offices of various professionals, including lawyers, accountants, and business consultants. Marcelo Costa's office was a modern but welcoming space decorated with contemporary darkwood furniture and especially shelves filled with legal volumes, transmitting simultaneously professional competence and human accessibility, characteristic of lawyers who develop skills to empathetically deal with traumatized clients facing complex legal crises. Marcelo personally received us at reception, demonstrating appropriate prioritization for an emergency consultation scheduled outside normal business hours, greeting us with firm handshakes and a facial expression, combining objective professionalism with genuine human compassion. Marcelo was a man of approximately 50 years with carefully combed gray hair, wearing a navy blue suit transmitting legal authority and especially brown eyes, demonstrating that particular quality of focused attention characteristic of experienced lawyers who learn to truly listen to clients instead of simply waiting their turn to speak. Marina, Roberto, please sit down and tell me in detail everything that happened today at the playground. Not omitting any detail, however minor it may seem, because frequently apparently insignificant aspects can prove legally relevant during complex legal proceedings, Marcelo instructed while leading us through a discreet corridor to a private meeting room equipped with a large conference table, comfortable leather chairs, and especially a digital recorder he turned on, after requesting our permission to officially document the consultation. During the following hour, Roberto and I alternated meticulously relating the entire sequence of that impossible afternoon's events, from my late arrival at the playground to the final confrontation with Vera, and traumatic withdrawal with our hurt and confused children about why they had been suddenly transformed into social pariahs, rejected by the little friends with whom they had been playing happily just hours before. Marcelo remained silent during our entire detailed narrative, only occasionally asking specific technical questions about exact chronology, precise phraseology of accusations Vera had made publicly, identification of all witnesses present during the incident, and especially about existence of video recordings Vera had deliberately produced, filming my natural emotional reaction to the false accusations. When we finally finished our exhaustive account, Marcelo turned off the recorder, breathed deeply as if mentally processing the complex legal implications of the situation we had described, and finally began explaining with professional clarity what would be our legal rights and practical options to proceed against Vera. Marina, Roberto, the situation you described clearly constitutes multiple serious legal violations, including malicious defamation through false public accusations about a stigmatized medical condition, invasion of privacy through dissemination of false medical information that should be confidential regardless of veracity, and especially causing intentional emotional suffering to your minor children through deliberately calculated actions to psychologically traumatize them via social ostracism. Marcelo analyzed with technical precision characteristic of experienced lawyers. Additionally, production and potential dissemination of video recordings without your explicit consent may constitute violation of image rights depending on how Vera intends to use that captured material. Marcelo's words confirmed we had solid legal grounds to sue Vera for multiple offenses, but he quickly warned about practical complexities involved in litigation against close relatives, especially when involving potentially compromised mental health issues. Before we initiate formal legal proceedings against your mother, I need you to seriously consider some important practical and emotional questions, Marcelo continued with a more compassionate tone. Family defamation lawsuits tend to be prolonged, emotionally devastating for all parties involved, and especially can create permanent and irreparable divisions in extended families, including siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins who will be forced to choose sides during public litigation. Additionally, if we can prove Vera was experiencing cognitive decline or psychological disorder when she made those false accusations, That may affect her legal capacity to be held criminally responsible, even though her actions caused substantial damage. Marcelo's realistic analysis about complexities involved in suing my own mother created conflicting emotional ambivalence where part of me wanted immediate legal justice for the damages caused, while another part felt apprehension about lasting family consequences of transforming private conflict into a public legal case. Roberto perceived my hesitation and intervened with characteristic pragmatism. Marcelo, regardless of emotional complexities involved in suing a close relative, our absolute priority is protecting our children from additional harm and especially repairing family reputation in the community before rumors irreversibly spread, destroying social relationships that are fundamental for children's psychological well-being. What practical measures can we take immediately to start mitigating damage without necessarily waiting for conclusion of prolonged legal proceedings? Marcelo nodded appreciatively at Roberto's pragmatic question clarity and began outlining a multifaceted strategy that would combine formal legal actions with immediate practical measures for reputational damage control. First, we'll prepare a formal cease and desist letter addressed to Vera demanding she immediately stop making any additional accusations about you or your children, that she destroy any video recording produced during the playground incident, and especially that she issue a public retraction of the false allegations admitting Marina doesn't have HIV and that accusations were made without factual basis, Marcelo methodically explained. Second, we'll prepare a detailed public statement including official medical documentation from Dr. Helena categorically proving Marina doesn't possess the condition alleged by Vera, and we'll distribute that statement to all families who were present at the playground during the incident, clarifying objective truth before rumors spread even further. The mention of distributing a public statement, including my private medical records, to neighbors, filled me with discomfort about exposing intimate personal information, even if necessary to refute false accusations. But Marcelo quickly clarified that disclosure would be limited to the minimum necessary to establish fundamental veracity without exposing unnecessary medical details. Third, I'll strongly recommend you hire a pediatric psychologist specializing in childhood trauma to evaluate Pedro and Lucas and provide appropriate therapy, helping them process that afternoon's experiences in a healthy way that minimizes lasting emotional damage, Marcelo continued with growing emphasis. Professional documentation about psychological impact on the boys will be crucial if we eventually decide to sue Vera for moral damages, including intentional emotional suffering caused to minor children. Roberto and I immediately agreed with all of Marcelo's practical recommendations, feeling some relief to finally have a concrete action plan instead of simply reacting emotionally to the impossible situation that had exploded into our lives without warning. Marcelo promised to prepare all necessary legal documentation during the next 24 hours and especially to schedule a meeting with Dr. Helena to obtain an official medical report appropriately formatted for use in legal context that would categorically prove the falsity of Vera's allegations. When we finally left the lawyer's office at approximately 9:30 at night, I felt simultaneously emotionally exhausted by that impossible day's trauma, and also minimally comforted to have competent professional support, guiding us through the legal complexities that would still unfold during following weeks, or potentially months. The return trip home was slightly less tense than the outbound journey, partially because now we had a concrete plan instead of just anguishing confusion, but especially because we were both mentally drained by the last hour's intense emotional processing and simply didn't possess remaining energy to continue obsessively analyzing the impossible situation. When we finally arrived home, we found Claudia sitting on the living room couch reading a book, while Pedro and Lucas slept peacefully in their rooms, emotionally exhausted after a traumatic afternoon, even though they didn't fully understand all the adult dimensions of what had happened. "How were the boys while we were out?" I asked Claudia as she gathered her belongings, preparing to return to her house 3 doors down. Claudia briefly hesitated as if deciding how much to share about concerning observations she had made during the last hours caring for children obviously affected by recent traumatic experiences. "The boys were well behaved but very quiet, Marina," she finally responded, carefully choosing words. They asked some questions about when they could return to play with their friends at the playground, and especially asked if they had done something wrong that justified other children not wanting to play with them anymore. I tried to reassure them, saying sometimes temporary misunderstandings happen between adults that affect innocent children, but usually resolve quickly when truth is adequately clarified. I thanked Claudia effusively for her generous help, and especially for having offered comforting words to the boys without knowing specific details about the nature of the misunderstanding that had so dramatically affected our family. After Claudia left, Roberto and I checked our children sleeping peacefully in their rooms, adjusted blankets, and especially observed for a few moments those innocent, childlike faces relaxed by sleep that temporarily freed them from confusions and hurts caused by cruel adult manipulations they had done nothing to deserve. Finally, in our own bedroom, Roberto and I prepared for sleep in exhausted silence, both individually processing that day's impossible events that had completely transformed our peaceful family life into a nightmare of public defamation and child trauma. Lying in the room's silent darkness, watching streetlight patterns filtering through curtains, my mind obsessively replayed every detail of that catastrophic afternoon, trying to identify warning signs I should have noticed anticipating Vera's elaborate attack before it could cause so much irreversible damage. But honestly, reviewing previous months of interactions with my mother, I couldn't identify anything remotely suggesting she was planning that type of cruel reputational sabotage against my family. Roberto, do you believe we'll really be able to completely repair the damage caused today? Or will our family be permanently marked by those false accusations regardless of how much contrary evidence we present? I asked in the darkness, breaking the silence that had settled. Roberto turned in bed, hugging me protectively, while considering my question loaded with anxiety about uncertain future. Marina, I can't promise we'll be able to completely erase memories of those false accusations from the minds of everyone who was present today at the playground, he responded honestly. But I can promise we'll do absolutely everything in our power to protect our children, to clarify objective truth to our community, and especially to ensure Vera never again has opportunity to cause additional damage through cruel manipulations intended to destroy our family, for motivations we still don't fully understand, but will certainly discover during legal proceedings that are just beginning. Roberto's words offered limited but genuine comfort as I finally allowed that impossible day's emotional and physical exhaustion to gradually lead me to restless sleep populated by fragmented nightmares, where I repeatedly relived that playground scene, but with anguishing variations where I was unable to protect my children from cruel ostracism, or where my own defensive words were distorted into confirmations of the false accusations I was trying to refute. The last thing I remembered before finally sinking into deep sleep was the iron resolution that regardless of how difficult the path ahead was, I would fight tirelessly to protect my family and to ensure justice was eventually served against the person who had deliberately chosen to cause so much suffering to innocents, including her own grandchildren, for motivations that remained mysterious, but would certainly be revealed as investigations and legal proceedings unfolded during following weeks and months. The morning following that restless night arrived with cruel clarity, making it impossible to continue hiding in the bedroom's comforting darkness, forcing me to confront the devastating reality that that playground nightmare hadn't been simply a feverish dream that would disappear with daylight, but rather a concrete event whose consequences would continue inexorably unfolding through the next weeks and potentially months of legal battles and reputational reconstruction. Roberto had already risen early, preparing a special breakfast for Pedro and Lucas in a touching attempt to create artificial normalcy through comforting routines. But the boys remained visibly withdrawn, pushing pancakes around their plates without characteristic appetite, while asking occasional questions about when they could return to the playground, revealing persistent concern, dominating childlike thoughts, even during apparently distracted activities. Mommy, will the school know about what happened yesterday at the playground? Will the other children in my class stop playing with me too? Pedro asked in a small voice loaded with anticipatory anxiety about possible expansion of social ostracism beyond the community playground's limits, into the school environment where he spent most weekdays interacting with classmates and teachers. The question revealed surprisingly sharp childlike understanding about how rumors spread through interconnected social networks, and especially demonstrated legitimate fear that that localized rejection could transform into complete isolation affecting all aspects of his social life. I exchanged a worried look with Roberto, recognizing we needed to act proactively before rumors about Vera's false accusations reached school administration through informal conversations between moms who had been present at the playground and potentially had children at the same school as our twins. Pedro, I'll call Principal Bruno today and we'll explain to him exactly what happened yesterday at the playground, showing official medical documentation proving the things Grandma Vera said weren't true. I responded carefully, choosing words to reassure without making promises I couldn't guarantee to keep. Principal Bruno has known you and Lucas for 3 years since you started studying at that school. He knows you're wonderful and healthy boys, and especially he'll ensure no child at school treats you unfairly based on false rumors. After we finished that tense breakfast, and Roberto took the boys to school with explicit instructions to immediately notify teachers about any signs of bullying or discriminatory behavior from classmates, I sat alone in the silent kitchen holding an already cold cup of coffee while gathering emotional courage necessary to make the first of many difficult calls I would need to execute during that impossible day. The mental list of urgent tasks was overwhelming in its extension. Call Principal Bruno at school requesting an emergency meeting. Call Dr. Helena confirming preparation of official medical documentation. Call Marcelo checking progress on the cease and desist letter directed at Vera, and especially consider whether I should or shouldn't try to contact my own mother to demand explanations about motivations for that cruel public attack against my family. The decision about contacting Vera directly was particularly complex because part of me desperately wanted to confront her demanding rational explanations about why she had chosen to deliberately destroy her own daughter's reputation through such serious false medical accusations. But another part understood any direct communication could be interpreted as implicit admission that her allegations had some validity deserving discussion instead of being simply malicious lies not justifying engagement beyond formal legal processes. Marcelo had specifically warned during the night consultation that I should avoid any direct contact with Vera until the official cease and desist letter was delivered, formally establishing legal boundaries about future communications, and especially documenting event chronology for potential use in subsequent legal proceedings. I decided to begin with the less emotionally charged call to Principal Bruno at school. Dialing the administrative office number I had memorized through years of routine communications about school activities, educational field trips, and occasional parent-teacher meetings that had always been positive experiences, reinforcing my confidence in the professionalism of the institution responsible for educating my children during significant hours of each weekday. Bruno was a 55-year-old, brown-skinned man with thinning gray hair and serious brown eyes, transmitting educational authority mixed with genuine concern for holistic well-being of students under his administrative responsibility, and especially had demonstrated during years of casual interactions that he valued open communication with parents about any question affecting positive school environment. "Good morning, Marina. What a surprise to receive your call so early. I hope everything is well with Pedro and Lucas," Bruno greeted with professional but friendly voice when he finally answered after 3 rings. His greeting's automatic cordiality painfully contrasted with the difficult conversation I was about to initiate about false accusations and potential discrimination that could affect my children in the school environment if rumors spread before objective truth could be established through official documentation and proactive communications with administration. During the following 20 minutes, I carefully related a condensed version of the playground events, focusing especially on false medical accusations Vera had made publicly and emotional trauma Pedro and Lucas had experienced through sudden social ostracism by little friends. Bruno remained in professional silence during my narrative, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific chronology, and especially about which other families from the school community had been present during the incident that could potentially bring rumors into the educational environment through conversations between parents waiting at the school door during entry and exit times. "Marina, I immensely appreciate you proactively informing me about this extremely delicate situation before rumors could reach school through informal channels," Bruno responded with growing seriousness. "I'll immediately convene an emergency meeting with all teachers who work with Pedro and Lucas to inform them about the situation, and especially instruct them to be especially attentive to any signs of bullying or discrimination directed at the boys based on false rumors about medical conditions they don't possess." Bruno's prompt and professional response offered some relief that at least one aspect of the impossible situation was being appropriately managed through proactive institutional intervention, but he quickly warned about practical limitations of what school could control in terms of other families' behaviors outside the official school environment. "I need to honestly warn you that although I can guarantee within school grounds during school hours your children will be protected against any form of discrimination or bullying related to these false rumors, I have limited control over what happens outside school, including conversations between parents at the entrance door, interactions at birthday parties organized by other families, or especially community activities like that playground where the original incident occurred," he explained with compassionate but realistic frankness. Bruno's sober words confirmed that completely protecting my children from reputational damage caused by Vera's lies would require coordinated efforts across multiple fronts simultaneously: school, neighborhood community, parent social networks, and especially formal legal system through proceedings against Vera that would publicly establish the falsity of her accusations. I thanked Bruno effusively for his professional response, and especially for his commitment to closely monitoring Pedro and Lucas's emotional well-being being during a difficult period that would inevitably affect their social confidence and psychological security, even within a generally protective and welcoming school environment. When I finally called Marcelo checking progress on legal document preparation, he informed me the formal cease and desist letter addressed to Vera had been finalized during the morning and would be personally delivered by a court officer still that day, creating an official notification record that would be crucial for future proceedings if Vera continued making false accusations or tried to disseminate video recordings produced during the playground incident. Marcelo had also begun drafting a detailed public statement that would be distributed to all families identified as having been present during the incident, clarifying objective truth about my healthy medical condition, and especially contextualizing Vera's accusations as malicious defamation instead of legitimate concerns of a responsible grandmother. Marina, I need to warn you that delivery of the cease and desist letter to Vera will probably provoke some type of reaction from her, whether direct contact trying to justify actions or explain motivations, or additional escalation through new accusations or attempts to mobilize other family members against you. Marcelo cautioned with professional caution. It's absolutely crucial you don't respond to any direct communication from Vera, regardless of how tempting it is to demand explanations or defend yourself against additional accusations, because any direct engagement can be used later as evidence you recognize validity of her concerns, instead of treating them as criminal defamation, requiring formal legal intervention. Marcelo's clear instructions about completely avoiding direct contact with Vera were rationally sensible, but emotionally frustrating because a significant part of me desperately wanted to confront my own mother, demanding explanations about motivations for behavior so bizarre and deliberately cruel that had traumatized not just me, but especially her own innocent grandchildren. The possibility suggested by Roberto and Marcelo that Vera might be experiencing cognitive decline or toxic online group influence offered some partial explanations, but still didn't answer the fundamental question about why that specific afternoon had been chosen to execute such an elaborate public attack against my family reputation. The following hours were dedicated to methodically executing all pending tasks on the mental list I had compiled during the sleepless early morning: retrieve official medical documentation at Dr. Helena's office, review and approve the final version of the public statement prepared by Marcelo, and especially begin the painful process of individually contacting each family that had been present at the playground during the incident to request an opportunity to personally explain objective truth before rumors solidified into unquestionable convictions based exclusively on Vera's false narratives. Each phone call to community families was an emotionally devastating experience, where I needed to simultaneously maintain dignity and professional composure, while essentially begging for an opportunity to prove innocence against medical accusations that should never have been made publicly. Marina, I understand you have medical documentation saying you don't have HIV, but Vera is your own mother and surely wouldn't invent something so serious without some real basis of legitimate concern, Patricia declared with stubborn conviction during a particularly frustrating phone call. Maybe you really don't know about your own condition because you had exams at a laboratory that made an error. Or perhaps Vera has additional information you're unaware of about risk exposures justifying concern, even if current tests are negative. Patricia's circular logic, where any evidence refuting original accusations was reinterpreted as simply evidence of deeper conspiracy or more elaborate deception, revealed a frustrating psychological phenomenon, where people invest so much emotionally in initial narratives, they become psychologically incapable of accepting contradictory information even when presented by authoritative sources like official medical documentation. After 3 exhausting hours making individual phone calls with mixed results ranging from genuine support to persistent skepticism, I finally received an unexpected call from an unknown number that revealed to be a contact attempt from Vera, completely ignoring Marcelo's instructions about the cease and desist letter that had been officially delivered just hours before. My first instinctive reaction was simply to refuse to answer, allowing the call to go to voicemail. But devastating curiosity about what possible explanations or justifications Vera could offer for such inexplicable behavior eventually overcame professional caution, and I answered trembling, while mentally preparing for verbal confrontation that probably would be recorded by Vera for later use as additional distorted evidence. Marina, we need to talk about what happened yesterday at the playground before you continue escalating the situation through lawyers and legal documents that will only make everything more complicated and painful for everyone involved. Vera began with a voice trying to sound reasonable and conciliatory, but carrying an underlying tone of calculated manipulation. I was simply trying to protect my grandchildren and other community children, expressing legitimate concerns any responsible grandmother would have about potential health risks, and you reacted in a completely disproportionate and aggressive way, transforming maternal concern into unjustified personal attack. Vera's audacious reformulation characterizing deliberately filmed false public accusations as simply legitimate concerns, and especially blaming my natural defensive reaction as the real problem, instead of her original malicious lies, revealed a level of reality distortion, seriously suggesting psychological impairment, or simply calculated sociopathy. Vera, you made completely false public accusations claiming I have HIV before at least 10 other moms while deliberately filming my reaction to use as distorted evidence, especially traumatizing your own grandchildren who watched little friends being dragged away from them as if they were dangerous. I responded, maintaining a controlled voice despite growing fury. That wasn't legitimate maternal concern. It was calculated malicious defamation deliberately intended to destroy my family reputation for motivations I still don't understand, but will certainly discover through legal proceedings my lawyer has already formally initiated. The cease and desist letter you received today makes absolutely clear any additional communication must be made exclusively through legal representatives, so this call ends now. I hung up the phone before Vera could respond, feeling my hands trembling from adrenaline of finally having directly confronted the person responsible for causing so much suffering to my family, but simultaneously worried that recorded conversation could be edited and used out of context as additional evidence in the distorted narratives Vera was systematically building. I immediately called Marcelo, reporting Vera had violated the cease and desist letter attempting direct contact, and he instructed me to meticulously document call details including exact time and specific conversation content, because that violation could strengthen our legal case, demonstrating a pattern of persistent manipulative behavior, even after formal warnings. Simultaneously with legal preparations, Roberto and I maintained constant vigilance over Pedro and Lucas's emotional well-being through regular sessions with a pediatric psychologist specializing in childhood trauma that Marcelo had recommended during initial consultation. Dr. Isabella was a compassionate 43-year-old professional specializing in helping children process bullying and social rejection experiences through developmentally appropriate therapeutic techniques including art therapy, role-playing games, and especially gentle conversations validating confused feelings without exposing boys to inappropriate adult details about complex psychological manipulations executed by a relative who should protect them. Pedro and Lucas are demonstrating typical signs of trauma related to sudden and inexplicable peer social rejection, including increased anxiety about social interactions, tendency to isolate during school recesses even when classmates try including them in play, and especially recurrent nightmares where they relive the experience of being separated from little friends. Dr. Isabella explained during a feedback session with Roberto and me after the third meeting with our children. The good news is that with appropriate therapy and especially with the stable and loving family environment you're providing, children this age generally demonstrate impressive resilience, recovering completely from traumatic experiences within a few months, as long as original stressors are removed, and they can gradually rebuild confidence in safe social relationships. Dr. Isabella's comforting words about complete recovery potential offered genuine hope, but didn't eliminate the devastating guilt I felt for not having been able to protect my innocent children from trauma caused by Vera's malicious choices, who had deliberately sacrificed her own grandchildren's emotional well-being to execute a personal vendetta against me for motivations remaining obscure, despite growing speculations about radicalized online group influence or possible age-related cognitive decline. The private investigation Marcelo had hired to examine Vera's recent online activities had revealed intensive participation in multiple forums dedicated to allegedly alienated grandparents' rights, where paranoid narratives about adult children conspiring to separate elderly parents were systematically amplified, creating echo chambers that gradually radicalized vulnerable participants. Marina, our investigation of your mother's online activities revealed a concerning pattern of growing involvement during the last 6 months in online communities promoting extremely toxic narratives about grandparent alienation by supposedly controlling adult children, Marcelo explained during an update meeting 3 weeks after the original incident. These groups frequently encourage dramatic confrontational actions intended to publicly expose supposed abuses, and especially create documented evidence through video recordings that can be used in future legal proceedings about visitation rights or grandchild custody. Vera's behavior pattern during the playground incident, making dramatic public accusations while deliberately filming your emotional reaction, corresponds exactly to tactics recommended in these online forums to build a legal case against allegedly abusive children. The revelation that Vera had apparently been radicalized by toxic online communities finally offered a partial explanation for behavior so bizarre and deliberately cruel that seemed incomprehensible through normal maternal relationship lens, but simultaneously didn't completely absolve her responsibility for conscious choices to participate in those communities, internalize paranoid narratives, and especially execute manipulative tactics against her own daughter and grandchildren based on fabricated conspiracies instead of objective reality of our perfectly functional family relationship. The question about whether Vera should be treated as a victim manipulated by toxic external influences or as a conscious perpetrator of deliberate family abuse remained ambiguous and emotionally complex, without simple answers satisfying simultaneously needs for justice and family compassion. The dramatic turn that finally brought some resolution to that impossible saga arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon, exactly 1 month after the original playground incident, when Marcelo urgently called me informing Vera had been hospitalized after a severe psychological collapse during preliminary hearing about the restraining order we had requested preventing any contact from her with our children until legal questions were resolved. During the hearing, when confronted with substantial documentary evidence completely refuting false accusations she had made against me, including my official medical documentation, testimonies from multiple witnesses describing her manipulative behavior, and especially expert analysis of video recordings she had produced revealing deliberate editing intended to distort context, Vera had apparently experienced a dissociative episode where her elaborate reality construction based on online forum paranoid narratives irreconcilably collided with objective evidence formally presented in legal context. Marina, the medical team at the hospital is conducting a complete psychiatric evaluation of your mother and preliminarily identified signs of delusional disorder, possibly exacerbated by growing social isolation and especially by online community influence that systematically reinforced paranoid beliefs about family conspiracy against her. Marcelo explained with a more compassionate tone than he had used in previous communications focused exclusively on legal aspects. The responsible psychiatrist suggested Vera genuinely believed in a distorted version of reality, where you were systematically trying to separate her from grandchildren, and that HIV accusations were part of a complex internal narrative, justifying dramatic actions to publicly expose supposed conspiracy and protect grandchildren from an allegedly dangerous mother. The revelation that Vera possibly hadn't acted with conscious malice but rather under influence of a psychological disorder, fundamentally distorting her reality perception, completely transformed the situation's moral nature from deliberate revenge into family tragedy where everyone was victims of undiagnosed mental illness, exacerbated by toxic social influences. The justified anger I had felt during weeks about Vera's deliberate cruelty was gradually replaced by profound sadness about loss of maternal relationship that would never be completely repaired even if psychiatric treatment eventually restored her connection with objective reality instead of paranoid delusions that had dominated thoughts during months of progressive online radicalization. What does this mean for legal proceedings we initiated against her? And especially, how does this affect our efforts to protect Pedro and Lucas from potentially harmful future contacts? I asked, trying to navigate emotional complexity of simultaneously feeling compassion for a sick person and need to protect my innocent children against additional harm, regardless of mitigating circumstances related to compromised mental health. Marcelo carefully considered my question before responding with that characteristic combination of legal professionalism and human sensitivity about impossible family situations, without simple solutions satisfying all conflicting interests completely. From a legal standpoint, psychiatric diagnosis doesn't completely eliminate Vera's responsibility for damages caused, but certainly creates mitigating circumstances that will affect how courts process the case, he methodically explained. My recommendation would be to propose a mediated agreement where Vera accepts submitting to intensive psychiatric treatment, including appropriate medication and regular therapy. Agree to temporary restraining order preventing contact with Pedro and Lucas until medical team confirms stabilization of her condition, and especially issue a formal public retraction of false accusations, clarifying to the community allegations were based on delusions instead of real facts. In exchange, we would agree not to proceed with criminal defamation lawsuit, but maintain option to restart legal actions if she violates agreement terms or repeats harmful behaviors in the future. Marcelo's proposal offered a pragmatic path balancing needs for justice, family protection, and especially compassion for a clearly sick person needing medical treatment instead of simply legal punishment. But implementing that agreement would require Vera to recognize the delusional nature of her beliefs and accept submitting to psychiatric treatment she had resisted during years of progressive mental deterioration. The following weeks were dedicated to complex mediated negotiations involving lawyers, mental health professionals, and eventually additional extended family members who had remained distant during initial controversy, but now mobilized to support Vera's treatment, recognizing retrospective signs of cognitive decline they had ignored or rationalized during months prior to the catastrophic playground incident. Finally, 3 months after that impossible afternoon that had completely transformed my peaceful family life into a nightmare of public defamation and child trauma, a mediated agreement was formally established where Vera agreed to all proposed terms, including intensive psychiatric treatment, temporary restraining order, and especially formal public retraction that was methodically distributed to all community families who had been exposed to original false accusations. The retraction letter Vera signed under supervision of her own lawyer and medical team explicitly acknowledged HIV accusations had been based on delusions caused by undiagnosed psychological disorder, offered genuine apologies for damages caused to me and especially to Pedro and Lucas, and requested the community treat my family with respect and understanding while we all collectively processed that traumatic experience. The months following that agreement were a period of gradual and painful reconstruction, where I slowly began recovering community relationships through honest individual conversations about impossible family situation complexities. Pedro and Lucas continued regular therapy with Dr. Isabella, demonstrating impressive resilience characteristic of children possessing stable and loving family environment, supporting emotional recovery, and especially Vera began the long psychiatric treatment process that would eventually help reconnect with objective reality instead of permanently living in a world of paranoid conspiracies, fed by toxic online influences. The decision about whether I would eventually allow supervised contact between Vera and my children after sustained demonstration of mental stability remained an open question I would periodically revisit based on medical professionals' recommendations, and especially on Pedro and Lucas's willingness to potentially rebuild relationship with a grandmother who had caused so much suffering, even if unintentionally due to mental illness compromising judgment. 1 year after that catastrophic playground afternoon that had so dramatically exploded into our peaceful lives, I finally felt we had reached some sense of restored normalcy, where Pedro and Lucas played again happily with friends at the same playground that had been the scene of original trauma. Community relationships had been gradually repaired through time and especially through consistent evidence we were a normal and healthy family, instead of secret carriers of dangerous diseases. And Vera demonstrated genuine progress in psychiatric treatment, retrospectively recognizing the delusional nature of beliefs that had motivated such destructive behavior. The most important lesson I learned through that devastating experience was that vulnerable people can be surprisingly quickly radicalized by toxic online communities, systematically exploiting insecurities, fears, and especially social isolation to transform previously functional individuals into participants in paranoid narratives, destroying family relationships through actions based on fabricated realities instead of objective facts. Did you like Marina's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there and I'll wait for you.